this started because some people who did not win the competition went to court against the nominations of some directors.
And just remind us of the background, why the government decided they needed these super directors.
Public administration is complicated, and the system of running public museum comes from kind of an older system where the directors of the public institution were art historians that in a way were thought more as conservators of patrimony collections and beautiful buildings, but were not sort of as managers. These new super directors had more direct link to the Ministry of Culture and larger independence in order to run effectively their institutions. The idea of the competition itself was to move the system forward, so obviously the system itself tried to stop the change,
So what changes have been introduced?
It has been allowed to function more effectively and become more like a modern institution with services to the public and have new relationship with corporate sponsors, and on the other hand, yes, they have like more power than
Nej, bara här! För de får bara gå upp. Ja.
The employees are under a contract of the public workers, so you don't really have the freedom to like fire and change your staff like you would in a different type of institution.
So what do you think is going to happen now as a result of this ruling?
Some museums are without a director at the moment, and like a vice director is running the museum. I guess we all hope that the ruling will be turned down and that these type of changes will be facilitated.
And I just on sort of practical terms,
I mean, the one that is most related like was for Valentina, where she was capable of merging two museums which were both state-run and were like a block one from each other, and that were run independently to function as one machine with the same ticket. The bookshop inside the museum being open in the evening, longer opening hours. This maybe is not so clear from abroad, but public workers in Italian museums have the same time slots as the worker in the office. So it's very complicated if you want to open a museum longer hours in the evening, or you want to be open on days of public holiday. You always have to find a way to push the system around. Well, obviously, if museums close on public holidays, you kind of are missing the big opportunity.
that was Ilaria Bonacossa, Director of Artissima Contemporary Art Fair in the Italian city of Turin. Just a reminder, if you want to get in touch with us about anything you hear on the programme, you can always do that on Twitter at BBC NewsHour, or direct to me at BBC Jamie, who are listening to the BBC World Service. This is NewsHour coming to you from London.
With bbc.com/news, you get the latest news stories anytime you like. bbc.com/news offers you the most comprehensive news coverage in the world, and its stories are easy to search and navigate. Whether you're interested in science, health, technology or business, the bbc.com/news website covers it all. It also gives you the opportunity to listen live to our news output, or check the latest breaking news with our minute-by-minute news feed. If you want to take the news with you, we offer you downloadable podcasts to listen at your convenience, or archive programming, so you can catch up on the programs you've missed. Or you can access bbc.com/news on your mobile phone. bbc.com/news also lets you give feedback direct to our program teams. All this content, coverage and opportunity is the BBC world leader in coverage online. bbc.com/news.
Coming up on News Now in the next 30 minutes, and you'll find in India. Australians issue a call for greater representation in Parliament. The children born with male and female sexual characteristics who are deceived by doctors, and as G7 leaders meet in Sicily, will reflect on Donald Trump's first international trip as president. All that coming up after the news.
Masked gunmen south of Cairo in Egypt have ambushed a bus carrying Coptic Christians. 26 people and wounding dozens more. State television says that many of those killed were children. The victims were on their way to visit a monastery. The celebrate it makes sense. In a district, Mr. Britain, Jeremy Corbyn, has called for left interventionist British foreign policy to reduce the risk of terrorism. His comments come as election campaigning resumed following Monday's bombing in Manchester. The governing Conservative Party said it was absolutely outrageous to link foreign policy to the Manchester attack. The American Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has said the special relationship between the United States and Britain can withstand the damage caused by leaks about the Manchester bombing. Mr. Tillerson condemned the release of information. A group monitoring casualties in Syria says an airstrike by the US-led coalition has killed at least 80 people in a town held by the Islamic State group. Those killed were said to be relatives of IS fighters in the town of Mayadeen. The coalition has not yet commented. Disaster management officials in Sri Lanka raised the number of people killed by floods and mudslides to at least 91. More than 100 people are missing. Cohabiting couples in Burundi have been asked to get married by the end of this year or face legal consequences. The government said this would help control population growth. President Nkurunziza, a born-again Christian, recently launched a national morality campaign. A chain of food shops in Russia has placed signs in its windows saying gay customers will be refused entry. The chain is run by a devout religious and nationalist businessman who has retreated to the Russian countryside to live as a peasant. BBC News.
Welcome back to the programme. Coming up next, a call for a radical shake-up of Aboriginal rights in Australia. Also, a new approach to the problem of drunk driving in India, where more than 150,000 people die every year on the roads, and where Indian police believe most of those deaths are due to drivers with high levels of alcohol in their bloodstream. So, how to go about getting the numbers down? Well, the authorities in the city of Kolkata are putting the onus on bar owners, as Raoul Tamden now reports.
With the WhatsApp bar in Kolkata, it is absolutely packed. As India's economy continues to grow, more youngsters want to come to places like this to party and have a drink. And everyone set up that owns this bar.
Young population with lots of disposable income, so why not? I see them watching in the city.
Driving in cities like Kolkata is a huge problem.
How much alcohol gets displayed? Those round questions have intensified after a crash against Model Sonica Japan in Kolkata.
In a model car, since then, you can get across the city and calls for the police to tackle the problem. So they've come up with some new ideas. Nick Goyle from Kolkata Police is leading the campaign.
If they don't have services like the driver's service, they can drive them home. The person is drunk. The other thing which we are requesting, we have these alcohol meters through which you can actually measure this, and it's fairly cheap device.
What can we show? Back to WhatsApp bar where the partying and the drinking is continuing. Why do so many people forget to get drunk?
To improve the greenness or the muttoness or the mardangi, as they say in Hindi, is if they can prove that after having 5, 6, 7, 8, they can still drive straight.
Yeah, I saw my friends drinking his driver so many times. And it's fun. Like I know that people drink and they go for rides because it's fun.
Sometimes they have a point to prove. So even if they feel that they are not able to drive, they will ensure that they drive.
So what do bar owners think of these new plans? Here's Anirban Sengupta again.
Look, we are in the business of hospitality. We are not in the business of policing. I also do not have the authority to go and, use a breathalyzer on any of my patrons. So sorry, we cannot do that.
And many people here think that the police need to enforce the law on the road and stop people who are drink driving. Sat at the corner of the program tonight with one of this country's most famous authors, Sandy Freud.
The problem here is that very often people try to come here because they feel they can get away with it. Because if they come come from a certain class of society, they feel that they have the connections and the privilege to get away with anything, including drunk driving. And so the problem is not so much with the laws, but its problem is always with the enforcement of the laws.
India needs to make drink driving socially unacceptable. Until it does, we'll have far more accidents on its country roads, which is pretty difficult to manage when you're sober.
And that was Raoul Herndon reporting from Kolkata. You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is News Hour, coming to you live from London. Jen Kumarasamy. Across the globe, the legacy of European colonisation continues to cause tension between indigenous populations and those descended from settlers. Arguments over indigenous rights, formal apologies, even reparations continue to this day, and perhaps nowhere more so than in Australia. Until a referendum 50 years ago, the country's constitution didn't give Aborigines full citizenship rights. They weren't even counted in the national census. Since then, campaigners have been arguing for another constitutional change, this time recognising the Aborigines as the original Australians. Well, today, Aboriginal elders from across the country met near Uluru, the giant rock at the centre of the country, known by colonists as Ayers Rock, to discuss whether they even want a constitutional language change. Their conclusion, they don't. Well, we'll hear what they did agree on in a few minutes' time. First, though, what's at the heart of concerns for Australia's Aboriginal community? Well, Sean Gordon is the leader of Darkinjung Aboriginal Land Council in New South Wales.
The heart of concerns is really that Aboriginal people in Australia haven't been recognised in the Constitution. We, unlike other countries, have been invaded by the British. There's been treaty agreements that have been put in place and have been put up and have been upheld, which has allowed those Indigenous people to be able to build an economic base, to be able to impact themselves, to be able to ensure that they have the rightful place within their own country.
What does that mean for Aboriginal people?
Well, what does that mean for Aboriginal people, I guess, is that we hit all the wrong indicators in regards to life expectancy. We have the highest incarceration rate of any people in Australia. We have the highest removal of children from our families today. The disparity gap in education is quite substantial. And the list goes on. For us, constitutional recognition or recognition of us as the first people of this country is a missing piece in this puzzle. For far too long we've been disempowered.
You say the government has all the strings, if you like. What does that mean if you're a business, for example? What are you unable to do? What are you lacking at the moment?
Well, when you look at our history and you look at we're colonised people, pretty much we've been pushed to the fringes. We survived the White Australia policy. The White Australia policy was straight up segregation. Aboriginal people weren't allowed in pubs. We weren't allowed to socialise with non-Indigenous people. We weren't allowed to leave the reserves and missions. So the only way that you could leave is if you signed away your Aboriginality, if you signed away your identity, you could effectively leave these places and go and attempt to try and participate in the broader community. So there was this clear segregation, no different to the apartheid in South Africa. And it wasn't until 1967 that we were counted as Australians for the first time. What we want is recognition for the wrongs of the past that have led us to the point where our people have been so disempowered that we hit all the worst indicators socially and economically in our own country.
So it's recognition and opportunity.
It's about recognition. It's about Parliament relinquishing some control. It's about us making sure that legislation, policy and programs have a positive impact on Indigenous people and not a negative. One of the greatest negative impacts on Indigenous people, if we look at our history, in our current constitution, and there are only 3 times in our history where the Racial Discrimination Act was suspended in this country, and that was to deal with Aboriginal people. One was the Northern Territory Intervention, which separated Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, but specifically targeted Aboriginal people, forced those people onto a basics card, so that any government income that they were receiving was received to a card. That was one group of people targeted within a whole territory. That that straight up is blatant racism.
Sean Gordon, the leader of New South Wales' Darkin Aboriginal Land Council, is speaking to me from Uluru. So what exactly did the agreement that was reached at today's meeting spell out? Well, Megan Davis is Professor of Law at the University of New South Wales. She's also herself Aboriginal and a member of the Referendum Council. That advises the Australian Prime Minister on the next steps towards a possible referendum to recognise the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution.
What we've been doing for the past 6 months is going around to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and speaking to them about constitutional reform. We've had 13 dialogues across the country, and what we've heard from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples is that they want substantive constitutional change, meaning that one of the primary models of recognition that the government was supportive of was a symbolic form of recognition that involved a statement of fact or statement of acknowledgement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, in addition to a few other minor amendments to the Constitution. And what we heard over that 30 regional dialogues is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people wanted structural reform, so substantive change. And that's what the statement settled on.
What does that mean in practice?
Well, what it means is that what communities appear to want is a form of constitutionally entrenched decision-making. We're looking at some kind of institution that will allow Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to participate more directly in the democratic life of the state.
Is that a separate institution or sort of greater recognition within the existing body?
Look, it's a body that would feed into the Parliament. So at the moment, one of the problems across the country is that Aboriginal peoples have very little input into the decisions that are made about their lives. But what we heard for 6 months, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples want to take some control over their lives, and they see this as being an effective way to do that.
What's your sense of how the government is going to react to the proposal?
Look, the government has said, as the opposition said, that they will accept the Uluru Statement in relation to the Referendum Council's report and take all of it on board. So we'll have to see to do that. That's important. Process, a deliberate process in which we have empirically captured the views of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across the country. So it will be very difficult for a state.
Medical professionals is to reveal uncomfortable truths to patients. But here in the UK, until as recently as 5 years ago, it seems that doctors have been routinely lying to one group of people, those born with a mix of female and male sexual characteristics. A patient support group has told the BBC that the practice of not disclosing a patient's genetic makeup, and in some cases performing genital surgery without their consent, was widespread. Faye Kirkland, the reporter who is also a qualified doctor, has been hearing from some of those affected.
This is a picture of me, I'm not sure exactly how old I was, probably about 10 months, but long curly hair and a lovely silk dress. 70 years ago, life was normal for Jeanette. When I was about 14, I was starting to realise it when I was at school that people were right with me because of my friends having periods and everything. And I had that. And at the age of 16, I had major surgery for an 8-inch scar right across my stomach. But she wasn't told what surgery was for, to remove internal testes. She'd been diagnosed with a rare condition called complete androgen-sensitive syndrome. I was genetically male, my body didn't respond to testosterone normally, so she appeared outwardly female. When I was older, I knew that I always knew something was wrong. And when I was 50, I was in hospital with a small lump removed from my breast, and I saw across the notes a big red listing with the words testicular feminization. So I said to the doctor, well, could you tell me what this is about? What did you say? You need to go and see your doctor. Now my doctor was the same doctor that I've had all those years, luckily. When I walked in to see him, I said, what, this word testicle, he wrote the white of the sheet. I said, I'll come to ask you what this is. He said, well, look, I'll give you all the notes. Go and sit outside and read them for an hour. I went out there and I read my notes, and that's when it said that I had to do the size of a matchstick and 2 fully grown testes, and I cried my eyes out. I went back in and I said, why didn't you tell me? And he said, because it's our section.
Professor Ian Hughes is Emeritus Professor of Paediatrics at the University of Cambridge. He says as a young doctor, you're expected to keep the diagnosis secret from patients.
The consensus was amongst the medical profession that to explain to a girl that she had grown up until that age, but actually she was a boy in terms of having testicles and in terms of having the Y chromosome, the male chromosome, that was deemed to be too stressful. And the explanation for why the person couldn't have periods, couldn't have children, the story I was spun out was the ovaries have not developed properly, and when they don't develop properly, there is a risk of tumor formation, and hence they need to be removed.
Were parents often told the truth, or were they told to lie to their children?
The general advice in those days would be for the parents not to disclose the true diagnosis to their children. In the androgen sensitivity support group, I have been involved with them as a medical advisor over the years, and a number of occasions there have been stories coming from that support group not too dissimilar from Jeanette's. In other words, these women finding out that they have a condition well into the early and late adult life, and having been told by the medical profession a pack of lies, if you like, understandably being incredibly angry with the medical profession, and sadly angry with their parents.
The Androgen Insensitivity Syndrome Support Group estimates more than 1,000 people contacted them about this practice between 1995 and 2015.
The practice nowadays would be to start engaging with somebody like Jeanette when she's about 7 or 8 years of age, to start explaining to her what's likely to happen at the time of puberty. And as she becomes more mature, then you move into the full information of why she can't have pain, why she doesn't have a uterus.
We need to be accepted enough for the people we are, and there's a stigma that goes with, you're different than everybody else, you don't understand what's going on, people don't tell you anything, you just take it all on board, and that is so wrong. Nobody needs to have that kind of a life. Where I've never had a life until last year, because I couldn't accept and love myself as the person I was. I couldn't think that anybody else could love me. And I've never had a close relationship. I've never known what it is to somebody put their arms around me and hold me and tell me that they love me. And I've missed that, and I would love to have had somebody to hold me and tell me that.
And that was Jeanette ending that report by Faye Copeland. If you want to see some photographs, go to our website, bbc.com/news. You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is News Hour coming to you live from London with me, James Kamarasamy. Still to come, we'll have an update on the investigation into the Manchester bombing and an assessment of Donald Trump's first trip abroad as president here on News Hour.
This is the BBC World Service, where the past comes to life each day. Witnesses about reliving important moments in the recent past by speaking to people who were there.
The police commander on duty here at Checkpoint Charlie has suddenly announced that they can go over.
We were the first to cross. We really were the first, and I only really believe we were in the West when we were sitting in a Mercedes taxi.
You think you might know about the subject, and then you realise you had no idea what really was going on.
I thought that state of apartheid was not so bad, and that was only later that I realized what apartheid was evil.
People remember things so clearly and so vividly.
What would they say if they should find out that I was the speaker of a black man in South Africa? But that very moment when he said yes, and I took out this little basin, was his feet, that was a life-changing moment.
Witness every day on the BBC World Service.
Reminder one of our top stories this hour, US media are reporting that President Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner is under FBI scrutiny for the engagement in links with Russia. Our US political reporter is Anthony Zerka.
The significance of this is that it is the Tory camel's nose into the tent of the White House, so to speak. Maybe no one closer to Donald Trump than Jared Kushner.
Other headlines this hour, gunmen have attacked a bus carrying Coptic Christians in Egypt, killing or wounding dozens of people. Britain's election campaign has resumed after the Manchester bombing, with the opposition Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn linking terrorism at home to military intervention abroad. And the US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, on a visit to London, has apologised for leaks to the media about the Manchester attack. You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is NewsHour coming to you live from London with James Kamarasamy. There's been another arrest today in connection with the Manchester bomb attack that took place on Monday. And as we reported on the programme yesterday, there's also an increasing focus here on the links between the man who carried out that attack, Salman Abedi, and Libya, the country that his parents left to come to England. The BBC now understands that Abedi may have fought in Libya during the civil war that toppled Colonel Gaddafi. I've been hearing more from my colleague Gabriel Gatehouse.
Look, I've got three different sources that say that the Manchester bomber Salman Abedi and his father Ramadan both joined the military brigade fighting to topple Colonel Gaddafi back in 2011. Now, Salman would have been 16 at the time. That's pretty young, not unusual for British Libyans to go out to Libya to fight at that time. You know, being enthusiastically cheered on by Britain, by NATO, by the media in Britain as well. 16 was pretty young. I spoke, one of the sources was a school friend of Salman's, and I spoke to him yesterday, and he said that, like many Libyan Mancunians, they waited for school to finish in the summer, June and July, and then they just went out there in their holidays. And he said that he joined a brigade that was fighting to take Tripoli, and when Tripoli then fell, they met up again in the capital, and there was a mood of elation.
As you say, pretty young at 16. Any sense of whether he was actually involved in frontline fighting?
Well, that's a question. The friend from Manchester, the school friend, said he thought that he wasn't involved in fighting, at least on the front lines, that he was sort of more towards the back of things because of his young age. Another source I spoke to, a family friend in Tripoli, said he thought that he was involved in fighting. So there's a bit of a question mark over that, and as I say, these things were quite fluid at the time. You know, lots of different sorts of people would go out, would join brigades. Some of them were professionals, doctors, lawyers, and that kind of thing. People were just kind of doing anything really to join in the revolutionary effort at the time.
Do you know which particular brigade he was involved with?
Well, one of the sources I have, there were lots and lots of different brigades, I should say. One of the sources I have says that it was the Tripoli Military Council. Now, this does make some sense given what else we know about Salman Abedi's background and his father Ramadan. So the Tripoli Military Council was led by Abdul Hakim Belhaj, who was a former member of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. Now, this is a group of Libyan jihadis who went out to fight in Afghanistan in the 90s alongside Al-Qaeda. They were banned in Britain in 2005 under the Terrorism Act, but paradoxically perhaps, quite a few of LIFG's alleged members, opponents of Gaddafi, were given asylum in the UK before that. There have been lots and lots of suggestions from different sources saying that the bomber's father, Ramadan, was perhaps on the periphery of this group, perhaps not a full member, but at least according to one source that we spoke to, he was in contact with various ex-LIFG members who came to Manchester after they left Afghanistan in the aftermath of 2011. The fact that he went out to fight in practice at the time, lots and lots of people were doing it, the government was turning a blind eye to it, so there's not necessarily anything that the Times untoward. It does give you an indication of the kind of milieu Sam and a baby grew up in.
Gabriel Gatehouse. Now, in the wake of the Manchester attack, Newso Extra this week is asking how major cities around the world can minimise the risk to their citizens from such atrocities. Bennett Jones and his guests are considering urban security, counter-terrorism and the compromises that different cities make between civil liberties and public safety. Now, that programme is available to download right away. Just look for BBC NewsHour Extra podcast. Well, before we go, we're going to get an update on events taking place in Sicily today, because that's where the leaders of the G7 are meeting. It's their first gathering since the election of President Trump, as well as several other leaders there. It's the final stop on the US President's first foreign trip as Commander-in-Chief. Well, our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale, is at the summit.
Well, so far today, the central issue has been the fight against terrorism around the world, and that's been led primarily by the British Prime Minister, Theresa May. In the wake of the bomb attack in Manchester earlier this week, she's been talking about what she thinks countries in the G7 can do to act collectively to try and deal with, issues that they say all these countries face. So she's been talking, for example, about what more they can do to put pressure on internet companies around the world to ensure that there's less extremist material on the internet, what that can be done to set up new technologies that identify this material and block this material, that alert the authorities about this material. They're also looking at other issues there. She had a meeting with the new president of France, Emmanuel Macron, and they discussed this and agreed that yes, more should be done. So there's a whole issue dealing with, global attacks that's taking place. We think there's going to be a statement later on today about specifically the situation that happened in Manchester earlier this week. So that's one side of this summit. The other side of this is about very much trying to see how Donald Trump fits into this new club that he's just joined. He has differences with some of the members over trade, over climate change, and there's a sort of delicate diplomatic dance going on to try and make sure that enough of the right messages are put out by all sides without it becoming an all-out row, because the overwhelming desire at the moment, I think, is to try and just, certainly from what's now called the G6, in other words, the countries that are not the United States, to try and just reinforce this idea in the mind of the Trump administration that multilateral organizations like the G7 and others are actually useful forums for policy to be discussed. And as this is the first time, not just for President Trump, but also other world leaders here, I think they're just trying to sort of, establish some of the ground rules and just see whether or not that fits with the Trump view of the world.
It's quite telling that phrase G6 isn't even being used, I have to say. But in terms of President Trump, I know you haven't been following him around, but you're there, I guess, with American colleagues. What is the sense amongst those who have been on this trip with him as to how it's all gone?
Two takeaway thoughts, really. One is that this tour has been a very disciplined period for the Trump administration. There have been few false steps. Mr. Trump has not been taking he hasn't done any press conferences, he's just done public statements. He hasn't been doing very many tweets. There have been no overt gaffes, apart from a slightly awkward brush past with the President of Montenegro yesterday. So from that point of view, I think certainly the American media are pretty frustrated, actually, because they've had minimal access, and the Trump administration have run a relatively tight ship. The second takeout thought I would have is this, namely that in the Middle Eastern end, Saudi Arabia and Israel, supportive, but over here in NATO G7, the Americans more willing to be contradictory.
And that was our diplomatic correspondent James Landale there, talking to me from Sicily. That brings us to an end for this edition of News Out. For me, James Kamarasamy, and the rest of the team, thanks for listening. Goodbye.
BBC.com/news, you get the latest news stories anytime you like. Whether you're interested in science, health, technology or business, the BBC.com/news website can offer it all. It also gives you the opportunity to listen live to our news output or check the latest breaking news with our minute-by-minute news feed. All this content, coverage and opportunity makes the BBC the world leader in news coverage online. BBC.com/news.
This is the BBC World Service, bringing our global audience news from around the world. On air and online, this is the BBC World Service, the world radio station.
Til Her og nå denne fredagen. Jeg heter Trond Sotrien, og dette noen av dagens saker. Forskjellsbehandling av pasienter på cannabismedisin. Bare de med diagnosen MS får beholde lappen. De andre som bruker medisin får ikke kjøre. Forståelig, men det forsker Ole Rødberg.
Fordi vi har pasientgrupper som bruker samme medisin, som vil påvirke kjøreferdighetene når det ligger i de to gruppene. Det er noen ting som ikke er tilsier at smertepasienter skal ha en markant større risikoøkning på grunn av inntatt av disse stoffene enn MS-pasienter har.
Mange barn blant terrorofrene i Egypt. Minst 28 mennesker drept i angrep mot kristne koptere. Og hvor blir det egentlig av laksen når den er på rømmen til oppdrettsanleggene? Ja, det skal forskerne nå prøve å finne ut. Skal først ha en nyhetsoversikt fra Trondheim.
Hjelpeorganisasjonen Caritas Norge er bekymret for situasjonen på den filippinske øya Mindanao. Styrker fra regjeringshæren kjemper mot militante islamister som har sverget troskap til terrorgruppen IS, og presidenten har erklært unntakstilstand i 60 dager. Det som skjer er urovekkende, sier programrådgiver i Caritas Norge, Aron Halfen.
Vi er først og fremst bekymret for sivilbefolkningen. Det er allerede veldig mange internproblemer på Mindanao som følger av tidligere trekninger mellom opprørsstyrker og militære. Og vi er også bekymret for at det kan få negative konsekvenser for de fredsprosessene som nå pågår på Mindanao. Og for den ene fredsprosessen pågår mellom kommunistpartiet og regjeringen. Der er det forhandlinger neste uke. Og det ble så sent som i februar brutt i forhandlingene etter trefningen nettopp på Mindanao.
I Tyrkia har flere tusen dommere fått sparken. De er beskyldt for å ha vært med på kuppforsøket i fjor sommer, opplyste den tyrkiske justisministeren i en tale i Ankara i dag. Det er likevel uklart hvilken rolle myndighetene mener dommerne har hatt, sier korrespondent Cecil Wold.
Det er veldig vanskelig å si, for det er jo mange her som har mistet jobbene sine under mistanken om at de har hatt noe med dette å gjøre. Men de som visste om kuppforsøket på forhånd, er etter det vi vet bare en veldig liten del av enkelte kemalister, enkelte gulenister, folk innenfor hæren. Så det er vanskelig å tenke seg at så mange tusen skal ha visst om dette kuppforsøket. Det sies jo også at Erdogan har brukt kuppforsøket til å rydde opp og til å bringe opposisjonspolitikere og andre han er uenig med, til taushet.
USAs president Donald Trump og Japans statsminister Shinzo Abe er blitt enige om å skjerpe sanksjonene mot Nord-Korea. Trump og Abe møttes på sidelinjen av G7-møtet på Sicilia i Italia. De to landene skal også samarbeide om å finne frem til støttespillerne bak Nord-Koreas kjernevåpen- og rakettprogram. USA og Japan sier også at de skal øke forsvarssamarbeidet i regionen. DNB legger ned sitt tilbud om å få utført banktjenester i rundt 1100 butikker når avtalen med Norgesgruppen løper ut 1. juni. Det skriver Nettavisen. Det er rett og slett ikke så mange som har behov for å sette inn kontanter på konto lenger, sier informasjonsdirektør i DNB, Even Westerfelt. Da fortsetter her og nå.
Det gjør vi, og vi skal høre at det er moraliserende forskjellsbehandling. Det mener sentrale rusforskere og myndighetene som nekter en pasientgruppe å kjøre bil. Cannabismedisinen Sativex har vist seg å ha god effekt for flere pasientgrupper i Norge. Det er bare de med diagnosen MS som får lov å kjøre bil, selv om de tar denne medisinen.
Altså, det er vanskelig for å se hva begrunnelsen for det skulle være fra et faglig perspektiv.
Ole Røgeberg er seniorforsker ved Frisch-senteret og snakker om det faktum at en gruppe pasienter, de som har MS, får lov å kjøre bil, mens smertepasienter som tar samme medisinen, mister førerkortet. Uforståelig, mener Røgeberg.
Fordi vi har da 2 pasientgrupper som bruker samme medisin, som vil påvirke kjøreferdighetene noenlunde likt i de 2 gruppene. Det er ikke noen ting som ikke er tilsier at smertepasienter skal ha en markant større risikoøkning ved inntak av disse stoffene enn det en MS-pasient vil ha.
Tidligere i år intervjuet NRK en smertepasient, en voksen kvinne som i årevis fikk behandling med smertestillende medikamenter uten at det hjalp. Så skrev legen hennes ut en munnspray, Sativex. Den er framstilt fra cannabis og har hjulpet mange smertepasienter. Men blir du ruset da?
Overhodet ikke. Jeg føler meg så klar og fin, og jeg har ingen reaksjonsmønstre. Altså, jeg reagerer like fort som før. Jeg tester meg jo litt da, på sånne spill og sånn, gjorde til å begynne med. Sånn responshastighet og sånne ting. Og det er jeg har ingen nedsatte funksjoner i det hele tatt, som jeg kan se der.
Denne kvinnen mistet kjørekortet fordi hun bruker munnsprayen Sativex. Ole Røgeberg har gått gjennom all forskning på ulykkesrisiko for trafikanter som bruker cannabis, og kombinert resultatene fra over 20 internasjonale studier. Cannabis inneholder stoffet THC. Det er det som gir en rusopplevelse.
I gjennomsnitt så er det slik at førere som har rusgivende stoffet THC i blodet, de har en svak til moderat økt risiko for ulykker, som i størrelsesorden 20-40%.
Dette er moderat sammenlignet med alkoholrus.
Hvis du tar for eksempel alle de som har en påviselig alkoholpromille i blodet, så har de en risikoøkning som er sånn 600%, 700%, så det er ganske mye større risikoøkning i snitt.
Det er Helsedirektoratet som legger retningslinjene for hvem som på medisinsk grunnlag skal ha rett til å kjøre bil. Avdelingsdirektør Bente Mo mener cannabismedisinen Sativex hjelper MS-pasienter til å kunne kjøre.
Det vi har gjort unntak i forhold til, er for disse pasientene som på grunn av sin sykdom har økte muskelspenninger, og som trenger et middel som gjør at de muskelspenninger løsner, som gjør at de faktisk